Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Joe Weisenthal.
And I'm Tracy Alloway.
Tracy, obviously, there's an infinite number of angles to artificial intelligence and what's going on in the industry. But one thing that I find striking about this that feels very different from other stories in tech, and I don't really know what it's about, is why you hear it talked about in sort of geopolitical strategic terms, and why countries, whether it's the US, China, but also Saudi Arabia, Europe, really feel like they need to have their own domestic model or champion. It's almost like it's like oil or something, where countries have at least been convinced that it's very important for them to have some sort of homegrown AI.
Yeah, you're right. I hadn't really thought about it, but that's absolutely true. People talk about it almost as a strategic resource at this point, and sort of in existential terms. And you never saw anyone talking about the need for a national SaaS strategy or something like that.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Right. You didn't know it. It's we have to have our own Slack, or we have to have our own
Salesforce.
We have to have our own British Salesforce and a Saudi Arabian Salesforce. But there's something about AI models, and it's sort of about the chips specifically, and everyone wants the chips, right? But there also seems to be something where countries want to really develop their own models and have their own open AI or whatever it is.
Yeah, I also wonder how much of it has to do with the data and the idea that the data is what you're training the model on.
Yeah.
And so there's privacy concerns isn't the right word, but countries want to have some control over their own data. They don't want full transparency.
Yeah.
So I wonder how much that feeds into it. But you're right. We have gotten used to talking about the AI arms race in one way or another. And we should dig into why that is. Why is it such a competitive piece of technology?
Totally. And I'd say, there's two other things here, which is that obviously the ultimate in everything these days, a lot of it is U.S.-China, and how U.S. models and U.S. companies compare to Chinese models and Chinese companies, which I don't think many Americans have much visibility on, or at least I certainly don't. I don't really know what China's AI strategy is. And then there's, of course, existing policy and how that might change under a Trump administration, and what that might do both to U.S.-China relations in general. And I don't know if that's going to, some sort of shift in how Trump might think about AI versus a Biden administration.
It is true that certainly the semiconductor portion of AI is something that has been competitive for a while now. And we've seen that in both the Trump administration and continued under Biden. So there is that kind of commonality running through it. But I am very interested in getting more of a handle on exactly what China is doing in this space and what it sees potentially as an actual threat here.
Totally. Well, I'm very excited to say that we have two perfect guests who really know all the dimensions of this topic extremely well. We're going to be speaking with Jordan Schneider. He is the founder of the ChinaTalk podcast and newsletter, one of my favorite sources for understanding what's going on in China. And we're also going to be speaking with Kevin Xu. He is the author of the Inteconnected newsletter and also a hedge fund manager at Inteconnected Capital. Writes fantastic stuff, sort of really digging into some of the technical and tech sides of all this. So hopefully we will walk out of here with a little more understanding. Jordan and Kevin, thank you so much for coming on Odd Lots.
Thank you so much for having us.
First time, long time. What a treat.
Love when people say that. I love hearing it. Reminds me of listening to sports talk radio as a kid. I'll just start with the question. What is it about AI? And is it inherent, or is it sort of the industry's marketing job? But what is it about AI that, unlike, as Tracy mentioned, different from CRM software, social networking or whatever, that countries really seem to prize having some aspect of it be homegrown?
Yeah, I couldn't help but chuckle a little bit when you guys are doing your intro about the national SaaS or what is your national CRM, since I am a software investor by day. It's really interesting if we think about how AI, when we talk about it generally, has been formulated. We're really talking about generative AI, right?
Yes.
Large language models in particular. There are a bunch of other AI machine learning use cases that we're going to, just stick to the side for now. There's something very deeply cultural when you start to model the entire your internet's information when it comes to large language model, right? It's essentially a three-dimensional space where every single token or every single word has a line that's drawn from one word to the other that kind of formulates knowledge or formulates, truth in a lot of ways. And I would say so far, given all the dominant products, ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc., they've been modeling the internet in general, which has a lot of content from the American internet, if you want to think about that, or Western European internet. And there are other versions of the internet in Japan and China in particular, where the ecosystem is such a walled garden that the way knowledge and culture and thoughts and history is being expressed is very different. And I think that is what triggered a lot of country to come to an understanding that this AI thing isn't just a blown up spreadsheet with good UI that you can track, pipeline or, have a bunch of messages going around to help your workplace go a little faster. It is a codification of your people and
collective
your history.
Truth and culture.
And I would say collectively your public discourse, maybe even an element of your private discourse that's being published on the internet is being codified in a particular large language model.
Just to add to that and bring up the U.S.-China context. So, if we take as a premise that the U.S. and China are in a strategic competition, what nations do when they compete is they try to, maximize national power. What is national power composed of? How big your economy is and how powerful your military is. Now, there's still a lot of debate today about just how important AI might be to the future of militaries and the future of productivity growth. But it is the technology today that has the most potential to really change long-term military and economic trajectories. And I think we've seen over the past few years the realization, maybe starting with the October 7th, 2022 export controls, that having a completely open exchange between the US and China is too much of a risk for American policymakers to stomach. And sort of in response to that, simultaneously, and particularly in response to the October 7th export controls, you've seen China really aggressively start to invest and support both their semiconductor as well as broader AI ecosystems.
Wait, so I want to press on this point that Kevin also brought up, but the idea of AI as a means of cementing cultural and informational control. Did anyone play around with the what was it called? The Study She Thought app? It was
I never played with that.
Yeah, it was the OpenAI app that was trained on Xi Jinping thought.
Here's the funny thing, is that app is actually kind of vaporware. We tried to find it on ChinaTalk, which you guys should all subscribe to, and couldn't. And I think this is one of the really interesting pieces of the Chinese government and how they're specifically playing on the sort of AI model side of things. Is I've sort of, if you look at a lot of the Chinese government sponsored projects so far, particularly on the model generation or national data set side, and you try to get to ground truth on them, there's really not a lot of there. But that's not to say that the Chinese sort of VC-backed model ecosystem isn't the real deal. We've seen companies raise multiple billions of dollars and be able to publish models, which are, maybe 6 months behind the leading edge when you're looking at OpenAI or Anthropic. And the sort of delta between the government-backed stuff that, can't pay for the best engineers or what have you, and these, Zhipu AI, Moonshot, Ernie at Baidu, those folks are really running just as hard as what you're seeing in the West.
Let me ask a related question, but in terms of Chinese AI models, what do we know about the data sets that they're being trained on? And are there any limitations that are introduced by the fact that, they are being developed within what is ostensibly a walled, the Great Firewall of China internet? Do they still have access to ex-China data sets that they can pull in, even if those aren't being sort of publicly dispensed to normal people?
So I think they definitely do. The one thing that all these Chinese tech companies, the model makers in particular, are very aware of, and I would say any tech company in China has to be aware of, is the red line they cannot cross when it comes to certain things that their product may generate, right? And I think this is one of the reasons why building a generative AI application or company in China is so hard. Yes, they do have access to, Wikipedia or the Common Crawl, any of the kind of the standard table stake data sets that you use used to train all the large language models so far. And then they can inject some of the data that is available inside the Chinese internet kind of garden, a walled garden, if you will. But there are two interesting things about the Chinese internet, right? One is, I'm assuming everybody who's listening to this is aware of the level of censorship that's in public discourse on the Chinese internet. That does not stop Chinese netizens from wanting to express themselves in a certain way. So if you are an aficionado of the Chinese language, you will see a lot of contortions of linguistic kind of acrobats being used in all kinds of ways to publish public in China that you can convey certain meanings, but when it comes to modeling the language, actually becomes very difficult to model the accuracy of the language. So that's number one. And number two, because of, again, the red line of censorship moving at all times, so it's not like a static target, a lot of contents actually get deleted on the Chinese internet. Things just disappear. You know, if you don't archive a certain article when you first read it, 2 days later, it might be gone for, reasons that a lot of people can't even decipher, even if you think about this all the time. And that reduces the quantity and I would say the quality of training data that exists on the Chinese internet in particular, that I think is almost a built-in disadvantage to a lot of Chinese model makers that are building their own LLM. You know, despite all odds, they're of course still continuing their effort to do so.
One thing I like about some of the AI conversations is they get into the realm of linguistic and linguistic theory. Can I just press you on that point about the nature of the language itself and the effect that that has on building a high-quality model?
Yeah. So I would say two things that's interesting about the Chinese language in particular is that, one, there are a lot of homonyms. There are a lot of sounds, there are a lot of characters that sound almost exactly the same. That means, nothing similar.
Oh, the famous example is the whole, it's either a poem or a very long sentence with, ma, horse, and all these. Ma can be, depending on the intonation, can mean a bunch of different things. You can construct a whole poem or sentence out of that single syllable.
That's right, like ma, 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 right? The four tones of the standard Chinese Mandarin language. And if you just put that into the tech context, Jack Ma, Ma Yun, the founder of Alibaba, has been either a celebrated entrepreneur or a villain, depending on how you think about his current public stature, right? That makes the modeling of any, let's just say, publicly available information about Jack Ma pretty difficult when you're also building a generative application on top of it. And there are a lot of these examples in the Chinese linguistic case that makes not just the modeling difficult on a technical sense, but also what can or you cannot generate based on the red lines that you may or may not have to cross.
Yeah. So just to play devil's advocate here for a second, GPT-4 was trained on 0.2% Mandarin and is 99% as smart in Chinese as it is in English. And when you look at what some folks out of the leading Chinese AI labs are saying, they're perfectly happy getting the vast majority of their training data from English and sort of porting it over to Chinese. So there is a little challenge there. But I also think it's the other thing on the sort of, are the models going to be lobotomized because they will be able to be too politically sensitive? I mean, look, I feel like this is basically a solved problem. If you try to make ChatGPT say something racist or sexist, it basically won't. And if Chinese internet companies have data sets on anything, it's all the posts that they've censored over the past 20 years. Having also tried to do this exercise of getting Chinese models to say politically racy stuff, it is a pretty hard slog. So, on the plus side, I think, not all data that's going to matter for the future of AI and its economic and military impact is going to be linguistic and text-based. And, being the world's manufacturing center, putting cameras into all those factories may help you train a sort of AI manufacturing robot a lot better. So there are real trade-offs here. And it's not just China is sitting behind the 8 ball on this.
I just realized how old I am, because I remember when China censors actually physically used to cross things out in newspapers that were imported in Beijing. This would have been around 2004 or 2005. It used to be done by hand. One thing I wanted to ask, since Kevin brought up the sort of vagaries of Chinese politics where one day something is really in and the next day something is very much out. We have seen that bleed into financial markets and specifically, funding for technology, primarily internet technology, SaaS in recent years, but also into housing and things like that with the 3 red lines policy. So I'm curious, what does the funding environment actually look like for AI at the moment? Is there a lot of government support for developing this technology?
And just while you're answering that, who are some of the companies that we should, who are the OpenAI and Anthropic of China that we should know about?
Yeah, and how are they raising money?
Yeah.
Is most of it coming from
VCs
or
What's
public
the environment
markets?
like?
Yeah. So when it comes to the AI model makers, right, I'll put that in one category of new startups, which actually kind of came up around the same time as all the other ones that we already know here in the US as well. You have Zhipu AI, which is purported to be one of the company that's closest to OpenAI. They are vowed to also develop AGI. They have strong academic roots from Tsinghua University. You have Moonshot that I think Jordan mentioned. You have 01.ai, which is Li Kai-fu's new venture building models as well. And I would say there are probably 6 or 7 Chinese unicorns that currently exist that receive funding mostly from your kind of Chinese standard VCs. These are VCs that are just like the Sequoias and the Andreessens of the world, right? You have Zhengfan, you have Hill House Capital, you have Hongshan, who was formerly Sequoia Capital China, and a few others pouring money into this particular lane, because one thing I think we should back up is that this is one of the very few lanes that VCs in China can actually put a lot of money into and expect the kind of return that you would expect from a pure financial VC, because a lot of other parts of the Chinese tech ecosystem has been battered down quite a bit because of all the differences in the policy crackdown that happened in the last few years or so. So those are some of the big model maker players. And a lot of them are attracting large corporate venture investments from Alibaba in particular, but also Huawei, Tencent, all the big dogs pouring into it. Very similar, again, to what we have here in the US, where Microsoft, Google, and Amazon all have their player on the field, if you will, when it comes to startups. And even some of the deal structures are similar. I think one of Alibaba's deal is that half of the investment they're making has to go into cloud credits to use the GPU service or in Alibaba Cloud to be able to train their model as a way to entice, but also to tie them into Alibaba's own ecosystem. So there are probably more similarities, I would say, than differences when it comes to the AI model makers funded by VCs. But that's about as similar as it gets.
Jordan, you mentioned the robots and the idea that another form of data is just all of the visual information that's inside a factory. And we did an episode on sort of the connection with AI and robotics with Josh Wolf, and we talked about some of these ideas. But, you mentioned, you're talking about, okay, they also want to achieve AGI. Are there distinct aspects, though, of the strategy that is okay, we are thinking about AI in the chatbot sense, or that is the way most people in the US think about what these AI companies have delivered? Is it the same with these Chinese powerhouses, or are they thinking about different forms of expression, maybe in a more industrial manner, et cetera, than the sort of chatbot idiom?
So, Joe, one thing that this is more of a recent development. So I think just last week, Shanghai hosted its annual World AI Conference, right? And during this conference, it's a big show, and there are, I believe, 25 different brands of humanoid robots that were on display in the expo, hall of this center. So that illustrates, I think, to you that I think the direction. I think Tracy asked about this. Where's the funding going to, right? I think if the national government were to have a say, a lot of the funding ought to be going to AI applications that are what I call hard tech, things that you can actually touch, things that actually do certain things in the real world, whether it's in a car factory, in a manufacturing shop, or even actual robots that will be in your home. And I think that is the direction that a lot of Chinese companies that are not kind of in the model building world are going into. And I think there's actually one very important kind of larger existential crisis that China is dealing with that a lot of people don't talk about in the context of AI, which is that by the end of this century, the UN is projecting that the entire population of China will go down to around 800 million to about 1.4 billion right now, so roughly halved. And half of that 800 million people will be people who are 60 years or older. So demography is destiny in a lot of ways. And if you're a Chinese policymaker staring into this abyss that we're just going to basically run out of people, then having a lot of AI robotics is almost a national imperative for China to solve its own demographic problem with or without everything else going on around the world.
Okay, so one of the benefits of having a command economy essentially is that Chinese policymakers can come out and say, we want everyone to direct their money away from, online internet e-commerce platforms and into hard technology like semiconductors or developing some new chatbot or something like that. But the downside is that you can get excess capital, to put it politely, crowded into these things. Is that a concern when it comes to AI, or is it that the technology is so strategically important and so competitive that it's not really a concern at the moment?
So I think it's an interesting contrast you can look at between sort of the AI model makers and the semiconductor and the broader semiconductor ecosystem. So what Kevin laid out, which is what I see as well, is basically like a largely private sector driven thing with the same kind of boom and bust or boom and like question mark that we're currently living into in the West happening in China. Now, what's happened in the Chinese semiconductor ecosystem over the past decade or so is really different. So, if you're talking about the U.S. CHIPS Act, which didn't come online until 2022 and is going to spend roughly $75 billion, like we've seen that level of investment doubled or even trebled over the past 10 years in the Chinese government. She is really semiconductor and hardware and industrial pilled. And I think he also from a long time ago saw the writing on the wall of these export restrictions coming on as semiconductors became a more and more strategic technology.
Xi Jinping sounds like he could be the perfect guest if anyone wants to disseminate that. If anyone's listening, someone who's
an open invite to Xi Jinping to talk about semiconductors.
If he's hardware and chip pilled, it sounds like he would be a great guest. So let's talk a little bit more. We know that the Biden administration has imposed, along with some allies, various limitations on the export of advanced chips and so forth. But why don't one of you just sort of give us like the broad outline beyond or including the chip limitations of U.S. policy towards, international AI policy towards China and how we're actively implementing the strategic aspect or the geopolitical aspect of AI?
Again, I started with this idea that AI is a strategic dual-use technology that has big implications both for the future of economic growth as well as the future of military power. So in September of 2022, a few weeks before the October 7th export controls, Jake Sullivan gave a speech where he said that it's not good enough to just be in the lead, but that the U.S. needs to have as far a lead as possible in critical emerging strategic technologies, AI being first and foremost on that list. So we've seen a number of different efforts on, from both a data and algorithmic as well as a compute perspective to make sure that America can continue to run faster than China. So from export controls, you have limitations on the types of chips which you can be exported into China. We've had EUV restrictions so that China can't make the most advanced chips domestically, the types of chips that the U.S. is no longer allowing Chinese firms to buy in country. We're starting to see more and more there's movement in the water around restrictions of letting Chinese firms access those types of chips abroad and with foreign cloud providers. And then there's also starting to be some interesting movement around restrictions when it comes to both data and algorithms. on the data side, you're starting to see new data walls be lifted with regards to electric vehicles in particular. We'll maybe see more coming forward. And then from an algorithmic perspective, 2 weeks ago, OpenAI said that they were no longer comfortable giving API access to developers based in the PRC, and that may be a harbinger of something larger. The Congress recently gave this the power to explicitly stop algorithmic exports. So the wall slowly but surely is coming up, and the Chinese developers and semiconductor ecosystems response to this is really interesting because you're seeing very aggressive investment on the hardware side. You see stockpiling of chips and even billions of dollars of the best of what NVIDIA can legally export to them. Smuggling too is starting to be a real thing. We recently saw some mainstream coverage of. So, there will be kind of gray areas and people trying to play corner cases to get more technology and access. Industrial espionage as well is something that's starting to bubble up a bit more. The scandal of sorts with Leopold Aschenbrenner getting fired, only for 2 weeks later OpenAI to bring on General Nakasone, the former head of the NSA, to shore up their internal controls, I think is an interesting leading indicator of what's to come on that front.
One of the things that you sometimes hear about restrictions on, for instance, semiconductor exports to China is the idea that by cutting off the country from all this external technology, you're only going to accelerate its own technological progress and its own development of leading edge chips and things like that. How much credence do you lend to those types of arguments?
I think it's a moving target right now. I think logically, you would expect China to put all of its resources into building the best GPU possible, right? If we all think AI is going to be the next big paradigm shift for national competitiveness, not just market competitiveness. Yet, right now, because of, I would say, the effectiveness of U.S. export control, 2 rounds of export control, and also working with allies around the world to solidify export control, it's actually been a very difficult time for China to catch up from the hardware side, both in terms of designing the best GPU possible, but also to manufacture the chips in bulk using its own chip foundry, SMIC, because China's been cut off from TSMC to be able to meet the demand that China itself, its own companies need to build its own product, let alone expanding to other parts around the world. And that's why you see all these behaviors still of either Chinese developers using VPNs and other ways to access OpenAI's APIs, or you have these sort of smuggling of prevented or prohibited NVIDIA chips into China to be able to keep the building of the infrastructure going. And I think that goes back to what you were talking about, Tracy, earlier, is that there is a limitation to how much the national government wants certain things to happen and whether that could actually happen or not when it comes to especially building hard tech in China when it comes to AI infrastructure in particular. We see a lot of pretty poor examples of government money being wasted in chip manufacturing already in the last few years before AI was even really a thing. And now it's in a very tough spot, I think, for a lot of people in China to be able to overcome the current hurdle. And I think this gap, this specifically hardware GPU imposed gap, will only widen when NVIDIA mass produces its Blackwell chip, which is the next generation of GPU that's going to be produced in bulk starting next year, which has a huge performance kind of advantage, roughly 32 times more than the A chips, which is what OpenAI used to train GPT-4 to be able to, close that gap. So I think, unfortunately, for the Chinese technology builders, the gap will only widen.
Jordan, I think you've talked about this before as well. The idea that if China is restricted in the amount of compute that it has access to, maybe there's a scenario where its own AI models just become really, really efficient in one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, this is, when you're under constraints and there's money to be made and, engineers will find a way, right? So on the compute side, right, it's interesting thinking about Blackwell. Only about 10% of the gains that it is making from the past generation came from node size. The vast majority of the gains that they've been able to squeeze into the Blackwell system are from stuff like optics and interconnects. And that stuff, high bandwidth memory, that type of stuff is a lot more difficult to export control than just one machine coming out of the Netherlands. So, it's difficult. There's tens of billions of dollars of R&D that's been on this stuff, but it's sort of an open question to me how difficult re-engineering all of the innovations that went into Blackwell is going to be versus re-engineering an EUV machine, which seems to be next to impossible.
This is an important point, just to jump in here. When in pop culture, when people talk about chips, it's almost always like node size and smaller. But
I like the idea of vibrant pop culture of semiconductors. I'm not sure we're quite there yet.
But this is how ignorant people like myself, if I think the cutting edge chip, it's just in my mind smaller node size. But this is a really important point that you hit on, that when we're talking about, say, NVIDIA GPUs, there are other dimensions that are actually much more important than node size.
That's right. And, if you look at all the new products that NVIDIA is releasing to the market, it's not a chip. Of course, you can buy a chip, but, it's really 8 chips together connected with high bandwidth memory and the interconnects and all the other elements that goes into a system. And the next generation, the packaging will be 36 chip and then 72 chip. And of course, there's a good reason for that, because all these models, if you believe that larger models become smarter models, then they need massive amounts of parallel processing to be able to train all these models efficiently and to deploy them efficiently. So that's why you tie up all these high-performing GPUs together. And I think that's what makes this hardware gap even more difficult from a system level for even a cloud level to really overcome. I think, before we've been talking a lot about the chip war between different countries. I think we're vastly quickly evolving into a cloud war between different countries competing on AI and technology in general, because it's all about the cloud and the system and how efficiently can you acquire and then utilize them that makes the big difference.
Tell me if I'm wrong here, but my sense also with semiconductor rivalry, maybe to a lesser extent, but certainly with the AI rivalry, is that it's mostly a competition between the US and China. As far as I can tell, Europe isn't necessarily obsessing about developing national chat GPT versions as much as, the US and China are. Why is that?
So, I think from the semiconductor perspective, right? It's really China and the rest of the world. There is a very integrated global ecosystem in which you have European players, East Asian players, South Asian players, the US, that are all kind of working together to push node size and improve the sort and develop the sorts of technologies which are going into something like Blackwell. And China, has kind of been cut off, or is at some levels being cut off from that broader ecosystem and having to start to domesticate a lot of the technologies that they were able to formerly rely on from other countries. Now, Kevin, I don't know if you want to talk to the every country with its own model and own cloud thing, because I think that's a really interesting new development.
I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think, not to beat on Europe too much, but I do think given just the regulatory, I would say, bias, right, towards releasing new technology really quickly in general, it just isn't a very hospitable environment to be able to build a product like ChatGPT, which was really released, I believe, on a whim or on a quick competitive note. It wasn't something that's super thought through, but because of the environment that we have in America, we allow that sort of things to happen, and then we think about regulation later. Coming back to the national angle, I think there is a strong sort of motivation, coming back to the cultural point, that every country does want its own national champion to some extent. I think France has Mistral, which it kind of puts up as its own national champion. It's a very strong open source AI model maker that has a lot of strong relationship with Microsoft as well. I think there's another company out of Germany that also is a model maker. So there are a few examples out there. Even Japan has, I believe, Sakana AI, which is its own possible startup national champion to model Japan's, culture or truth or knowledge or whatnot into a national model. And India has a few others as well. And the Middle East is another very important region that is playing an increasingly large role. I think as the government actually pushed out some really good open source model about a year ago called Falcon, that series, which has been able to put the Middle East on the map when it comes to national development of AI models. So there is a lot going on, but certainly not nearly as much as the US-China competition besides that.
Actually, you just reminded me, this is something I've always wondered as well, but what is the state of open source in China? Like, is it as much of a thing as it is in the States or elsewhere? What does that actually look like in terms of sharing code and things like that?
So it's very much a thing. In fact, I used to work at GitHub, which is one of the largest code repository of open source code, and to drive international expansion. So I got to work with a lot of Chinese open source developers, and it's actually one of the very few, I would say, vibrant communities that really embrace a lot of openness, transparency. They have this really nerdy holiday on October 24th, which if you, binary is, 2 to the 8th. 2 to the 10th, actually. But basically, it's called Programmer Day, and it's a completely grassroots holiday in China that celebrates open source development. They have, a huge party, a huge convention. They talk about open source sharing. They all use, GitHub or Hugging Face or all your usual open source collaboration platform. So the open source kind of movement, if you will, has really deep roots in China. And that has been around for a couple of decades already before we have this kind of open source, closed source model dichotomy that's happening in AI. In fact, a few of the nonprofits that are kind of government affiliated in China has released open source models as well as a way to showcase what they have done, as a way to kind of both compete, but also to collaborate with academics and researchers elsewhere.
Yeah, just coming a little more on the government open source connection. It's easier to be like, open source is a good strategy, particularly if you're behind. We've seen a lot of investment on the hardware side with RISC-V, as well as Kevin mentioned, on the software side. And I think it's still an open question, but there's a lot of chatter on the Chinese internet about just to what extent the Chinese model makers are dependent on Meta continuing to drop open source models in the Llama series. And, we may, if and when Zuckerberg decides that he's done playing the open source game, we may see a very different trajectory for the Chinese model makers if they're not able to kind of, get their algorithmic and hardware shops in order before then.
So we just have a few minutes left, but we talked about the current state of U.S. restrictions toward China, or how the U.S. thinks about AI in the geopolitical context. There are chip export controls. There's more being done, when it comes to cracking down on industrial espionage. There have been a lot of stories, including several broken by Bloomberg, about academic collaboration and limiting who can talk to whom. And we know that there's a lot of issues in academia related to computer science and tech and Chinese researchers in the U.S., et cetera. We have this framework, but it might all change because the party of the presidency might change in a few months. What do we know, if anything, about the Trump view towards AI and AI in the geopolitical context?
So I think the interesting about Trump is that during his presidency, his first term, he actually did have worked on national AI initiative of something, which I believe is also chaired by Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. And he signed on to some kind of a national initiative plan in 2020, but it was, middle of COVID. None of us had any time to pay attention, and it just kind of didn't go anywhere. But he did have some kind of history with AI. But based on the most recent kind of national, the Republican Republican National Convention's platform just being released, one of the line item is that they will overturn Biden's AI executive order so Trump can put his own spin or his own branding or his own substance on AI if he does become a president again. So we can expect a lot of kind of volatility on that front. And another thing that I would say that I think is the most consistent thing about Trump is his unilateralism, right? He's always been about America first, American only. And right now there is a pretty good rhythm of global AI governance that's happening, starting with in the UK, the Bletchley Park Declaration, to a summit in South Korea earlier this year, to then another summit in Paris in February of next year, where you have world leaders, including China, and all the other relevant departments and ministries around the world coming together to talk about AI governance in a global sense. If I were to put my money in the betting market about Trump, I think he will probably blow a lot of that out of the water to go to his unilateral instinct and really put America's stamp on this. And it's hard to predict what that will look like.
Trump went on the All In podcast, maybe the podcast that must not be named on.
No,
this
it's
show.
fine. It's fine.
It was really remarkable because they asked him about China and AI, and he had a moderately sophisticated answer, which was sort of shocking. He, identified that it's a race between the U.S. and China, and he also said that energy is really important to data centers, and we got to make that happen. If you edited down his comments from 5 minutes to 30 seconds, it was pretty coherent. But it was a remarkable thing that he was talking to someone about this, and they got two halfway decent talking points in his head. So, how he's going to approach technology in China is a really open question. On the one hand, we had this very well thought out, sophisticated playbook that he ran to basically get the world to turn on Huawei. On the other hand, we had a lot of weird Trumpy stuff, like with ZTE. The Commerce Department was basically going to kill it. She called him, said that it was going to cost too many Chinese jobs, and then he went on and tweeted the next day saying, too many jobs lost in China, we're going to give ZTE a reprieve. So he's really of two minds on all this stuff. Maybe someone talks him into being scared about inflation. Who knows? But I think there's a very wide range of outcomes, both on the sort of his domestic approach to artificial intelligence, as well as how he's going to think about technology competition in China.
You said something there that actually I wanted to ask, and this is just about the sort of technological arms race again, but obviously within the U.S. and the data centers, there is a lot of anxiety about access to electricity and how are we going to supply that. And we all know the U.S. is not in a good state these days of building things and adding a lot of energy capacity. Is that when you think about U.S. versus China in that respect, could that be a comparative advantage for the Chinese companies? I mean, I know China continues to add more nuclear generation, and they're probably more liberal in terms of adding more coal power and other things like that. Could they end up with an advantage based on their electricity grid and solving the power side of AI?
This might be a bit of a red herring. I am cautiously optimistic that Republicans and Democrats will end up kind of giving some, NEPA exceptions for these data centers, which everyone is now agreeing is this incredibly important national strategic resource. I mean, I think the bull case with China, right, is if they're stuck with less efficient chips and just have to build data centers twice the size that are twice as expensive, then maybe they can throw on a few more coal plants and nuclear reactors to get them going. But I am cautiously optimistic that NVIDIA will continue to make increasingly power efficient chips, and state, local, and national regulators will understand that this is something worth bending the rules on, which is sort of what you've seen on the sort of semiconductor fabrication build out over the past few years with the CHIPS Act.
And if I can add one more point to what you just said, Jordan, I think a lot of the focus that we've talked about has been the algorithm, the model, how powerful the GPU is, but a lot of engineering sources has been devoted and will continue to be to reduce the power hungriness of AI model. Because one of the big things that's a hugely hotly debated topic is that all these tokens that we're generating for all these apps are just way too expensive, right? The expense comes from the compute and then the power that's being consumed to it. So there will be a lot of engineering that is going to accomplish when it comes to reducing the cost and the need for energy over time. So I don't think the energy trade is a long-term long-term investment thesis, but maybe a short-term arbitrage as far as how much extra power we need just to feed the hungry AI data center when all the engineering is going into reducing that dependence, because everyone sees how that could be detrimental in a lot of ways.
Jordan and Kevin, thank you so much for coming on Oddlots. That was fantastic. Our goal for the episode of understanding this more, I feel I do. So thank you both so much for coming on.
Oh, that was great.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Tracy, I thought that was great. I mean, there were just a bunch of things that even setting aside the geopolitical aspects that I just didn't know about what the AI, space looks like in China. And if that was very helpful right there.
I'm sort of obsessed with the Programmers Day now. I want to learn more about the holiday. Do you think all the open source programmers, they all get together to celebrate and do a dance? Maybe a bite dance?
Yeah. Oh.
Boom! Come on.
Good. Okay, Tracy, we'll leave that one in.
Thank you. So the producers will add that cricket noise that we have on hand.
I am also interested in the holiday. I do think, so Kevin's first answer, I just thought was really clarifying about why a country might think that having a national version is important, right?
Yeah.
Because and I hadn't really thought about it in those terms, because on some level, right, it's easy enough. If it's, llama, you can use that anywhere on, various chips and stuff. But the idea that the AI is going to codify truth as it means in the context of that country. And, if China, their version of what's true, Kevin gave the Jack Ma example, which is that one day he may be a hero and one day he may have a villain, or maybe a villain, that's always changing. And so there may be some impulse to have the model sort of correctly reflect what is state policy. But this idea that it creates this version of the national identity, culture, and language is very interesting.
No, absolutely. And I think China is sort of the extreme example of that. And that's sort of what I was alluding to not very well in the intro when I was talking about data control. But there is this cultural element to AI where you are using something like ChatGPT, or maybe not at the moment, but you could imagine a future where you're using something like ChatGPT in the same way that you're using something like Wikipedia, where it's almost like the codified public version of events, right? And so if you are a government like China, why wouldn't you want to have some degree of control over what that's spitting out and the narrative that it's building?
I was also really intrigued that, we talk about chip wars all the time, but the idea that there is a distinction that is useful to make between a chip war and a cloud war. And that, there is, we all know that supposedly, smaller nodes or whatever are better, although I think in the context of GPUs, that's less important, but that so much of the technology is about the interconnect. And we talked about this with CoreWeave, that there is a distinct element to building up a very powerful GPU cloud versus a traditional cloud because of the cables and the packaging, et cetera. And so the idea that it's about more than just the chip itself and, the size of that chip, so to speak.
No, absolutely. And one thing that really stood out from that conversation, and I'm thinking back, this actually happened when I was in Hong Kong and I was, coordinating some of the news coverage there. But I remember the big crackdown on the sort of retail internet companies like Alibaba. And I remember at the time, policymakers were very, very specific and very deliberate and very open about trying to direct more capital, less disorderly capital flowing into SaaS, more capital going into hardware and making things like chips. It was almost, for lack of a better tech analogy, it was like flipping a switch, right? They basically said no more money going into retail tech, everything going into semiconductor manufacturing and all that stuff. So it was interesting to hear both the challenges and the opportunities from that perspective in China.
By the way, I don't know if it was the Financial Times, but that was the first. Whoever came up with ChatGPT, that was very clever. That was very well done. I first saw that in that word in the FT, but that's a pretty clever term. That was a good one.
I'm disappointed to find out it's actually vaporware, although perhaps not surprised. Okay, shall we leave it there?
Let's leave it there.
This has been another episode of the Odd Lots podcast. I'm Tracy Alloway. You can follow me at Tracy Alloway.
And I'm Joe Weisenthal. You can follow me at The Stalwart. Follow our guests, Jordan Schneider. He's at Jordan SCHNYC, and check out his ChinaTalk newsletter and podcast. And Kevin Xu, he's at Kevin S. Xu, and check out his writing at Interconnected. And follow our producers, Carmen Rodriguez at Carmen Arman, Dashiell Bennett at Dashbot, and Kel Brooks at Kel Brooks. Thank you to our producer, Moses Andam. And for more Odd Lots content, go to Bloomberg.com/oddlots, where we have transcripts, a blog, and a newsletter. And you can chat about all of these topics 24/7 in our Discord, discord.gg/oddlots. We have an AI room in there. Maybe when this comes out, we'll see if either Kevin or Jordan or both would be up for doing an AMA in there the day it comes out. I'm sure people have a lot of questions, so we'll try to make that happen.
And if you enjoy Odd Lots, if you want us to, start a pop culture semiconductor spin-off show, then please leave us a positive review on your favorite podcast platform. And remember, if you are a Bloomberg subscriber, you can listen to all of our episodes absolutely ad-free. All you need to do is connect your Bloomberg account with Apple Podcasts. In order to do that, just find the Bloomberg channel on Apple Podcasts and follow the instructions there. Thanks for listening.